My name is Nick Ludlum. I'm Senior Vice President of Communications with CTIA. I am joined today by Enrique Duarte Melo, who is Managing Director and Senior Partner at Boston Consulting Group. Enrique, hello.
Hello, Nick. It's a pleasure to be here.
It's a pleasure to have you, and thank you for joining us. I'm really excited to have you here today because we're going to talk about a new report that Boston Consulting Group put out about a month ago on how to build the 5G economy, which is very topical and very timely. And I wonder if you could just start by talking just at a high level, what did you set out to achieve with this report?
Thanks. When we started writing this report, what we wanted to do was to look back at the experience with previous generations, 4G, 3G, and also look at the changes coming to 5G to better understand what would be the key success factors in building an economy that leverages 5G in terms of the job creation and the GDP impact.
So you say you looked at prior generations of wireless. What did you learn from that? What was it about the 4G build out and 4G as it has existed over the past 10 years? What does that tell us about 5G and the 5G build out?
What we learned is that really the impact from these past generations was in terms of how do you set up the foundation for success so you can have the maximum impact on the economy. So for example, the really key things to look at were things like a spectrum, network deployment, the innovation ecosystem, if you will, the business environment, and obviously the talent around it.
One of the things the report looks at, and that you've just alluded to, is really what's the right way to look at, say, 5G leadership, and what's the wrong way to look at that. And one of the dominant narratives over the past couple of years has been the idea of a race to 5G with China. Can you talk a little bit about what Boston Consulting Group's view of that is, and why maybe that approach, that way of looking at things, is wrong, and this other approach is right?
Yeah, look, what we have seen in many cases is a narrative that can paint just a partial picture. When people just focus on the number of antennas or the number of users without the proper context, it doesn't give you the complete picture of the impact of 5G. We believe that looking at the impact it has on the economy, looking at the penetration, and looking at how the foundational elements that I mentioned are having an impact on jobs and GDP is a better way to look at whether or not the deployment of 5G or previous generations have been successful in the country.
So the report looked at and established what the real success factors are, in 5G. Could you maybe talk us through what those factors are?
Absolutely. I mean, it's the five that I mentioned very briefly before, but let me maybe add a little bit of color, right? There's the spectrum. At the end of the day, wireless communications, by definition, without a spectrum availability cannot function. So spectrum is always something we highlight at the beginning, the spectrum availability. There is a network deployment. I think several companies have invested a significant amount of money already in the US in making that available, but that is an investment that will have to continue in the infrastructure. And also it's something that can be facilitated and encouraged by government policies. The third one is the innovation ecosystem that foments the investment in R&D and other areas. The fourth one that I mentioned is the business environment, right? And making sure that there's the early startup funding that enables other use cases for 5G. And the last one, obviously, is talent and the availability of the skilled workforce that can leverage the benefits of 5G to help in the impact on the economy.
So there's a lot of material on each of those factors in the report, but I wonder, just to maybe drill down on one, where would you say the US is in terms of a spectrum?
I think when it comes to spectrum, the US has taken many very positive steps. One thing that is important to understand, maybe taking a step back, is that when you think about 5G, really there's a spectrum in different bands. There's the low band, the mid band, and the high band spectrum availability for 5G. I think mid band is the only one that I would say the US probably had still some work to do coming into 2020. However, I would say that in 2020, there were several positive steps in that area, and more are expected in 2021.
So broadly speaking, how would you say the US is progressing? When you look at your five factors, when you look at the history of 4G, how would you see the US is progressing in its journey to the 5G economy?
I'm very optimistic about the progress. Look, it's early in the deployment of 5G. If we look at previous generations like 4G, those were deployed in 2010, and you didn't see the full impact until you started going several years, right? And there will be a progress that has to be made over the next few years to have the full deployment. But if you look at the start of how this is moving in terms of the different policies, the investment that has been made, I am very optimistic about where the US is in 5G.
I wonder, we have a little bit of time. If maybe we could talk, do a little future casting and talk about where you think all of this is going. The report obviously looks at how we build the 5G economy, but what's some of the potential that you see and that Boston Consulting Group sees in the 5G economy?
I think what we're going to see is three phases to this impact in the economy. The first phase is what I would say just the availability of a robust 5G network. And that's the part where you just see the increased data, the increased density of devices, the increased speed, how it's impacting the mobile services. I think then there's a second phase that you're going to see that has more to do with some of the use cases that it enables when you start looking at other industries that are impacted by the potential use of 5G. If I use the last generation 4G as an example, the impact was not limited to just the higher data rates, but some of the things that it enabled, like ride sharing and other elements of the economy, that honestly would have been very hard to imagine even at the start of the 4G deployment. And I think we're going to see a second phase that is similar in 5G. And then beyond that, I think it's a third phase that has to do more with the overall impact on US economy because of increased productivity when you start looking at industrial applications, because of increases in health and safety when you can start looking at things like healthcare. And so I think the way I would look at it going forward is that there are different phases that are going to start hitting or benefiting the US as the 5G economy continues to deploy.
Now, you mentioned that at the start of the 4G economy, with the launch of the first 4G networks, we didn't, nobody could have envisioned ride sharing. Nobody could have envisioned quite the way that 4G would transform our economy. But that being said, and as we're at a sort of a similar stage with 5G, are there particular industries or applications that you see as promising or maybe just personally interested in?
Oh, absolutely. I think that one thing that is great about 5G is that we're not just talking about more speed, but we're talking about more instant response with a lower latency and more densification, or the ability to have more devices. And that opens the door for a number of other applications that were not possible with 4G, both in the industrial landscape, where you can start having a number of applications with both public and private networks, and a bit maybe further into the future, things that enable connectivity, for example, for cars and other vehicles. And you start then opening the realm of what is possible, right? You can start seeing things like telemedicine being more of a reality, again, because of the lower latency and the reliability of the communications. That opens up applications that could be considered mission critical and perhaps too sensitive in the past, but that with 5G can become a reality.
Well, that's great. Thank you. And thank you very much for sharing your thoughts with us. The report is a really interesting one. It's available on your website. It's available on ours. And I think there's a lot for us to consider and for others and for policymakers as well. So thank you for your time.
Thank you for having me, Nick.